Hi, this is Adam again at The Noise Chap. We're going to do a quick video looking at how to do a noise assessment this time. From the very off, ignore that thing down there. Every time I speak, it starts spinning. It's not right. So, if you're going to do a noise assessment, first thing you need to do is be at least vaguely familiar with your limits. So you're looking at obviously 80, 85 dBA and 135, 137 dBc. Kind of ignore the 87 dBA one for now. That just tends to confuse things. So if you need more information on that, have a look on the website. So you then need to look at getting yourself some noise meters. Now, this is before you even start the noise assessment. For the noise meters, you need to have a proper noise meter. And by that, I mean one that is what's called class 1 or class 2 integrating. Now, if I unpick that a little bit, noise meters come in classes, and for the noise regs you need at least class 2. You can have class 1. There is actually a class above that which is for proper noise nerds in labs, but you can ignore that one. Class 1 is a little bit more accurate. Class 2 is perfectly fine, and that is what the noise regs say you should have. Unless you're going to be doing a lot of noise assessments, get class 2. Class 2 is a lot cheaper and for not a lot of difference in quality. Integrating is an important point. Integrating means the noise meter measures the noise as an average over time. So if you measure for 2 hours, you will get an average for 2 hours. If you measure for 2 minutes, you get an average for 2 minutes. So integrating means it gives you the average over that entire duration, versus cheaper noise meters that will say fast or slow. That's not integrating. Cheaper noise meters have a value in telling you whether you may need a noise assessment or not, but if you paid a few £100 for the noise meter, chances are it's not good enough, and you need to have a very least class 2 integrating noise meter. Phone apps, if anybody suggests doing a noise assessment with a phone app, take them around the back of the bins and give them a slap, because absolutely no way. Phone apps are useless. They're uncalibrated. They're not even consistently inconsistent. One day they might be 1 decibel out, the next day they might be 8 decibels out. So no, never use a phone app. You may also need wearable dose meters, or dosimeters, or sometimes dose badges. These are basically a small noise meter that you can put on the shoulder of a victim, and they have a use. So for example, if you're trying to get the noise assessment for a forklift driver, you can stick a little noise meter on their shoulder and they wear it as they go about their work. The alternative is you jogging alongside the forklift truck waving a noise meter at them, and you really don't want to be doing that. Just a word of caution on these: be very, very careful with these wearable noise meters. They have a use, but they also lead people very wildly astray. They can give very inaccurate results. They're susceptible to interference, more often than not accidental. So you put it on somebody and they move their clothing slightly and their collar starts to rub the noise meter. And that will give a huge reading, even though it is actually very quiet. But because it's actually touching the noise meter, it gives a big spike. Also, I would absolutely bet the mortgage that the second you put a noise meter on somebody, they walk away, their mate will see them wearing it and will bellow down the end of it. They do it every single time, and it doesn't matter how much you tell them not to, somebody will shout down the end of it. Also, as soon as somebody walks away wearing a noise meter, you've lost control of what that measurement actually is. You see a big spike or a big peak on that meter later on. You don't know what actually caused it. So it's far better for you to be there. One final thing I have come across with these is an issue where the background noise is maybe 82, 83 decibels. So below the main limit, you put a wearable meter on people They go ahead, carry on with their job, and then you get the result back and it's 91 decibels, saying there's an issue. What's generally happened, if you've got a group of people, the noise meter has recorded the volume of their own voice as they're talking. Now, if it's sitting on their shoulder, their voice is being directed away from their ears, but the noise meter is picking it up extremely loudly. So you have to be really careful in situations like that, where you come back with a reading saying there's a problem here, but then if you stand there with a handheld meter at the same time and measure it, there really isn't. The one final thing I would mention on noise meters, if you're only going to do a noise assessment occasionally, it's probably not going to be worth buying in the noise meters. I've got quite a few of them. I've spent about £18,000 on noise meters. And that's a lot of money if you're not going to use them very regularly. Also, you have to get them calibrated. And I probably spend maybe £2,000-3,000 a year every year on calibration, probably a bit more actually in some cases. However, you can rent them. So there's a website you can go to, noisemeters.co.uk. I have no affiliation, but I do use them myself. So I tend to buy a lot of my kit, and you can rent kits from them from there. So you've got your noise meters. There are 5 steps really into doing the noise assessment. First off, and it sounds obvious, but have a quick look and identify what it is you're measuring. Now that sounds a bit simplistic, but the obvious ones are the production. Your standard production, you know about that. But not all loud noises happen all the time. So you have to make sure that you are planning your assessment to cover everything. You may have, for example, in a food factory, the morning shift and the afternoon shift generally do almost exactly the same type of work. But very often the night shift from 10 p.m. onwards is actually a hygiene shift. So they're doing very different work, maybe doing cleaning down, so have a very different noise exposure. It is fairly common that night shifts have a slightly different noise exposure to day shifts, could just be slightly quieter. Also, don't forget engineering or maintenance. There may be jobs they only do very occasionally that still need to be included. So you've looked at the jobs. Next is you just need to identify who you need to measure. And again, it sounds a little simplistic. The production people, obviously. But also, do you have other managers who come in and go around the site occasionally? Could be production managers, could be salespeople bringing potential clients in. How often are they going to be in the production area? Do you need to assess their type of exposure? Do you have office staff who occasionally go into a high noise area to find people, to talk to people? Also, contractors, do you have any who are routinely present quite a lot? So if you have very specialised machinery that may be operated by contractors for you, you need to include them. Agency staff would fall into that as well. And one final bit on the people, just have a ponder, do you have anybody who you already know has a hearing problem? So the obvious one is people with hearing aids, but are there people who already have a hearing issue, in which case you need to really make sure you are including them. So the next bit is measuring the noise itself. Now, don't forget, the noise exposure limits are for 8 hours. So it's 85 decibels for 8 hours. So it doesn't matter if it's 88 decibels for 10 minutes. That's really not going to be an issue. So you need to make sure you are doing this time weighting as part of it. If a job is consistent, you may only have to measure for a couple of minutes. If it's making the same noise all day, once you've got a decent result on your noise meter, it really doesn't matter if you measure for 2 minutes, 2 hours, 2 days, you're going to get exactly the same result. If you have a job that is cyclical, make sure you measure from start to finish the full cycle. So if that cycle is 5 minutes, great. If that cycle is 5 hours, you're going to have to measure for 5 hours. So you measure for the full cycle. Sometimes you can break the longer ones down. So if they do part 1 of the job for an hour, measure that for 10 minutes, get your result from that. Then you can measure part 2 separately, part 3 separately, and there are ways of adding it together later on to get the daily exposure. So make sure you've measured the entire cycle, either in pieces or as one go. I've got to stress you must calibrate the noise meter before you start the measurements on the day. Noise meters do wander. They can be affected by temperature and humidity, so you must have calibrated them before starting the first one. Is one of the most commonly misunderstood bits. You have to have measured everything to enable you to calculate an 8-hour daily exposure. If you have a look on my website, there is a noise exposure calculator on there, so you can break a job down into 2, 3, 4, 5 sections and say, well, they do this for 10 minutes, they do this for 30 minutes, they do this for an hour. Add the noise levels in and the exposure durations, and it will calculate a daily exposure for you. Don't forget, the outcome you're looking for is not a list of machines and noise levels, and it's definitely not a map of the site with some noise levels marked on. That's not a noise assessment. What you're looking for is an reasonable estimation, to use the HSE's jargon, of the average daily exposure for the people you're looking at. The type of outcome you're looking for then is things like welders have a daily average of 88 dBA, a peak of 119 dBc, and an average dBc of 91. Those are the three numbers you're looking for. So it's average dBA, peak dBc, average dBc. If you have the type of site where the jobs are not routine from day to day, that gets a little more complicated. You need to vary it a bit. So I'm thinking joinery workshops, some welding fabrication shops where people start a project and work on that same project from start to finish. So they're not actually working on a production line, and what they do on any one day probably has no relation to what they do on any other day. In those specific cases, you really then just need to focus on the noise from that machine. That is an exception because there is no other way of getting the noise level for it. So you've got your noise exposures for the people. The next thing you have to do as part of a noise assessment is decide on what control measures. So you've identified whether they're over 80 or 85 dBA or 135, 137 dBc. There is a pattern you need to follow. So is there anything you can do to eliminate the noise? So can you get a new machine that just runs a lot quieter? Are there means of reducing the number of people exposed or the exposure of each individual? So you can use things like job rotation. Now, I did a job fairly recently where the noise in one area was about 86 decibels. In another area, it was about 79. So we actually recommended changing the staff over on alternate days, because if they did that, their weekly noise exposure, which you can use as well as daily noise exposures, their weekly noise exposure for people came down to below 85 dBA. That takes them out of mandatory hearing protection. It takes them out of hearing testing. So can you do something with job rotation? So when you're looking at minimizing people's exposures or reducing people's exposures, you can say, well, I will reduce the number of people who are exposed to this. So from experience, I did a job in Winchester where they had to cut steel sections. They used to do it in the middle of the factory, and it was creating a hell of a loud noise for a lot of people. They built a separate shed outside and moved that cutting process out there. The number of people who are exposed dropped dramatically. The 3 people who were still exposed to it, yes, they're still exposed to the noise, but they'd taken something like 15, 20 people out of the high noise area. So you've done what you can to either eliminate the noise. Actually, I think of it, elimination is not a work thing, but I have a petrol chainsaw. It's tremendously noisy. Your ears ring after only a few minutes if you've not been wearing hearing protection. And I recently bought a battery-powered chainsaw. It does exactly the same job. Nice big blade. There's no reduction in power on it at all, but it is so much quieter. So you've identified any ways of reducing the noise. Only if risks persist do you then provide hearing protection. So as part of your noise assessment, you must assess the suitability of the hearing protection. And that's a whole other subject in there. But the 2 things to make sure are, is it protecting enough? And is it not too strong? So you have to make sure that there is enough protection, but not too much protection. Overprotection is a very real issue. If you have too much protection, people generally stop wearing the protection because they can't hear what's going on around them. Particularly if they have things like forklifts moving around, they want to hear what's going on. If they have earplugs, they leave them sticking out of their ears. As an employer, you still have to monitor and enforce that use of hearing protection. So making sure it is correct for the noise risk is important. Your noise assessment should also identify who needs the mandatory noise safety training. So that's anybody who's regularly exceeding 80 dBA, and also who needs things like either optional hearing protection, mandatory hearing protection, or the mandatory health surveillance, the hearing testing, which applies to anybody who's over 85 dBA as a regular daily exposure. So you've done that, you then need to record all this. So you must write it all down, what your noise exposures are, what can be done over time to reduce noise levels, who needs to be provided with hearing protection, who needs mandatory noise training, who needs health surveillance. You don't have to identify them by name, but do identify the job or the position so that it can be linked back to a particular type of work. And that is your noise assessment. One thing I would flag, remember, you have just done a noise assessment, not a noise risk assessment. Okay, there is a difference. The noise regs require you to have a noise risk assessment. The noise assessment, all that thing about measuring the noise and identifying people, that's a big chunk of it. So you've done the bulk of it there. But a noise risk assessment is that, plus your training records, plus your health surveillance records, PPE issue, what your procedures are for monitoring and enforcing the use of PPE, things like that. And also make sure you have recorded when this noise assessment should be reviewed or repeated.